for me. I've known, I can call you David, just in the spirit of all the Davids.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ms.
For
Pogrebin.
many years. And this is a wonderful book. I can't show you that it is not only a great read, but it is it has the virtue of so few biblical books, which is that it's brief. At least you can read it in a weekend, and I think you actually will, and feel not only like you get the story in a way you haven't before, but that you want to see it come to life on film, which may happen. Am I right, David? Are you listening to me?
I am, but I'm not allowed to comment on that.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. You are. I'm not.
All right. It's a possibility.
It is a possibility. It might happen.
So, David.
Yes.
Fratricide, patricide, rape, adultery, 100 foreskins.
You're talking about the book, right?
Were you worried? Were you worried people would be bored with this material?
Well, actually, I am not worried, but I'm amazed that people don't know it better, in the sense that it has all those things, and that David is a very problematic character in a lot of ways, and people somehow, even well-educated Jews, know very little about his story. I mean, they know something about David and Goliath and something about David and Bathsheba, but that's pretty much it, when in fact, as you point out, it's cinematic.
Why do you think they don't know about it? Why is this? Is it being skipped? Do people think it's too complicated? Is it too racy?
Yes, all those things. First of all, it's not in the Torah, it's in the Tanakh. I mean, it's in the second part of the Torah, which most people don't stay in Hebrew school long enough to find out about. And second, it doesn't fit into any of the categories that we are comfortable with. One of the things the first point that I make in the book is David's not one of those heroes. Is it okay if I look at them sometimes too?
Yeah, it's fine. I won't be hurt.
That David is not one of those heroes that, like, he has a cute flaw, you know? There are some heroes that, like, oh, sometimes Churchill got depressed. Isn't that sweet? But David's not like that. I mean, David is awful sometimes. David is a murderer sometimes. So we don't want to think about our biblical heroes that way, and I think that that's part of the reason. And then, as you said, it's a very complicated story. And there are parts of the story, I mean, if you follow the narrative line pretty cleanly, then you can follow it. But there are lots of little digressions and so on that you need a good editor to tell you to leave out.
You chose not to tell it in a linear way.
Right.
How did you get?
Well, the way that David's story is told reminds me very much of a montage. That is, you see David is given 3 different introductions. Once Samuel comes to anoint him, once he goes to kill Goliath, and once he's brought to Saul's house to play the lyre, because Saul is, I don't want to diagnose, I'm not a psychiatrist and it's thousands of years, but he's manic depressive. So just between us, this should go no further. Well, he has vast mood swings, I'll just say that.
David, just tell everyone who Saul is.
Saul is the king who precedes David, and David starts off as a person in his house. He plays for him, he encourages him, he brings him out of his depression, but later Saul becomes murderously jealous of David. There are other entanglements as well. David marries Saul's daughter. It's very complicated. But as a result, none of those 3 introductions seem chronological. That is, after David goes to Saul's house and plays for him and brings him out of his depression, then at the Goliath scene, Saul says, "Who is that kid?" And so it's very hard sometimes to figure out who David is supposed to be at any moment, both because of the erratic nature of his conduct and also because of the chronology. So what struck me more than anything else about David is that there's almost not a human role conceivable in that time that he doesn't occupy. And so instead I tried to tell the story mostly chronologically, but really according to his role as a lover, as a husband, as a king, as a warrior, as a sinner, as a father, as a child, all those things, so that the different pieces of him would come to life.
And before we sort of begin, because I do want to back up to him as a child, when you were a child or a teenager, this had personal resonance for you. Can you explain?
So I never thought so much about my name, because there were always a surfeit of Davids, because I went to a Jewish day school and everyone was named David. By the way, I'm very honored that David Ellenson is here. Oh, there's another one.
I have to say that my husband's name is David, and his mother calls him King David. So
really? So he's Jewish then?
No, he's Jewish.
Yeah, so there was that. During the Birkat Hamazon, when David gets mentioned, I would always tip my kippah, and my father would give me a disapproving look. Not really, but I would tip it, but he wouldn't be so disapproving. But so David is like rampant all over the Jewish tradition, so I never thought about it, and I knew when my father's father died, his uncle Dave helped raise him, and that was how I got the name David. But then, in my high school yearbook, my father wrote this short sort of collage of verses from the Tanakh about David, and then he added a little and changed a little, and it was very beautiful. And when I went to the sources to see where he took it from, since he didn't put a verse, I realized that he sort of half made it up, and I wondered who this David was. And so I began to read about David, and I saw the great paradox of David's life is that he is so problematic a character, but there's something about him that makes him what his name means, which is beloved. And David is the most, you may not know this, but one thing you can certainly say is David is the most beloved character in the Torah. He is the only man of whom a woman says that she loves him, his daughter Michal. Saul loves him, even though he ends up trying to kill him. Jonathan problematically loves him. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. And the people of Israel love him. So that made me see the choice my parents made differently, and the name David differently.
You seem to say that he is also the most whole, and I think you used the word vital person in the Bible.
Yes.
And I don't want you to sort of give away the story, but in what way do you mean that?
I mean that most of us are people in pieces. And there are vast areas of life that we're not a part of, or we don't participate in, or somehow they're satellites to our central concerns. But David's not that way. David is, the way his story is depicted, every role is extraordinarily alive. And in fact, maybe the best way to illustrate it is that unlike most great relationships, where you can think of Romeo and Juliet, or Damon and Pythias, or King Henry and Becket. David's not that way. David has so many relationships that are symbolically weighted. There's David and Jonathan, and David and Michal, and David and Bathsheba, and David and Saul, and David and Goliath, on and on and on again. David and Abigail. About whom, by the way, Abigail, as long as we're on Abigail, the only woman in the Bible about whom it is said she's intelligent before it's said she's beautiful. Both are said, but intelligent comes first.
That's the story of my life. And I've had a lot of therapy for that.
So I'm not going to say the other thing about Abigail, which is she gives the longest speech in the book. That's okay.
Okay.
But so David is all these things. He's a complete person, which is a rare thing in life, forget in the Bible.
Did you hesitate, because it's obviously not the first book written about David, how much did the scholarship that preceded you?
Right. So I hesitated not so much because I didn't think I'd have anything new to add. I hesitated more because, I want to put this nicely, Jewish scholars, like other scholars, they're not really fond of people who are not specialists in their field writing about their field. I think that's the nicest way to put it. So I was afraid that I would write this book only to be subject to
the experts.
The experts, right. And this still may happen, although the first review from an expert came out from a Christian Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann, in the Christian Century, and it was very nice, and I was very relieved. But that's what worried me, is that, I'm encroaching on a field in which a tremendous amount of scholarship has been done, and I haven't spent my life as a Bible scholar, so that concerned me, and I did my best. And
before we get into David, they approached you, Yale University Press, and apparently Moses was taken?
Right, that's exactly how he put it. Steve Zipperstein, who is the editor of the series, said to me, We'd like you to write a book. We thought you would want to write one. The Yale Lives covers the span of Jewish life. I mean, there was one on Trotsky, and there was one on Emma Goldman, so modern Jews too. He said, we thought you would want to do the Bible, but Moses is taken. So I said, okay, I'll go with David.
So David as a kid, is he leadership material? Is he special?
David is special in the sense that he's aggressively unspecial. That is, when Samuel goes off, God says to Samuel,
Who is a prophet?
who is a prophet, who is actually, he's the leader of Israel at the time, right? And he anoints Saul the first king against his own inclinations, because he doesn't want, this may not shock you, he doesn't want to give up power to a king, because he's enjoying being the prophet, and he feels like a king is secular. But he, in the end, is persuaded by the people to anoint Saul, and then God comes to him after Saul, for a variety of reasons, is rejected by God. And God comes to Samuel and says, I want you to go anoint this kid at the house of Jesse. And so Samuel says, I can't do that, because if Saul knows, he's going to kill me, which is true. Saul would. And then God tells Samuel to lie, which is another thing that you may not know about the Bible. You may not know that God instructs people to lie. I'm making this plural, but at least in this case, God instructs him. He says, just tell him you went there to sacrifice to me, which is not true. That's not real. I mean, he's going to sacrifice while he's there, but that's not why he went there. He went there to anoint David. So David gets anointed amidst this, what I call in the book, a cloud of mild deception, right? He already, at the very beginning, David has a dodgy start. You know, things are not on the up and up. And Saul goes off to his house, and he meets Jesse, and he says to him, basically, present your kids. And out comes the firstborn son, Eliav, who's tall and handsome, strapping, and all the tall characters in the book of David meet a bad end, which is, reassuring. And Samuel's ready to anoint him, and God says, don't anoint him. He's not the one, because people don't see the way I see. You see what's visible, and people see it, and I see into the heart. So Samuel goes, next kid, please. And he brings out all 7 sons, which, as you know, in the Bible is the perfect number. And none of them is the right kid. And so finally Samuel says, don't you have any more children? And Jesse says, oh yeah, the little one is out back tending the sheep. And he brings him in, and it says he's young and ruddy-cheeked, and God says to Samuel, rise and anoint him, this is the one. So David is the child who's sitting in the back of the class, who nobody notices and nobody pays attention to. His own father forgets to introduce him. His mother's name is never mentioned anywhere in the book of Samuel. So it's not too much of a stretch to think this is the kid who's gifted but neglected, and as a result feels like he has something to prove.
So when he steps up and says, I'll kill this giant,
Right.
that's his instigation, his initiative?
It is totally his initiative. God doesn't tell David, you have to kill Goliath. David comes in the manner, my younger brother is here tonight. Danny, where are you? Oh, there you are. He's right in front of me. See, they get neglected, these younger brothers. So he can say, since I have 2 older brothers and he has 3 older brothers, I can say this is the time-honored manner of younger brothers. This is what happens. David comes, and his father says to him, bring some food to your older brothers, because they're like out there fighting. And what are you doing, David? You're sitting at home. So David goes and he brings the food to his older brothers, and he hears that Saul has said that whoever kills Goliath is going to get a reward. He says, and you should know that in the Bible, the convention is the first words out of your mouth define your character. The first thing you say. David's first words are, what will be given to the man who kills Goliath? But his second sentence is, because Goliath has defiled the God of Israel and so on. I mean, he's got that part too, but it's very interesting that those are the first words out of his mouth. And then his older brother says to him, get out of here. What are you doing here? You're always trying to insert yourself in places you don't belong. And David says, as younger brothers always do, I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you upset with me? But in fact, David then decides that since no one's going to kill Goliath, he's going to do it. And he goes to Saul and says, I'm your guy.
And he's very good at the slingshot, right?
Yes.
I mean, so that, have you read Malcolm Gladwell's?
I did. I wrote a review of it, not entirely
Positively.
Not
Okay,
entirely
we won't go
positively,
there.
but his, well, only because I thought that it was a series of disorganized stories. But I mean, he's a fantastic storyteller. And he has an interesting section on David and Goliath, and he points out, which some scholars have said, David was no underdog. He has a long-range weapon. Goliath has a spear. Which would you rather have? If you're good at the slingshot, much better to have a slingshot than to have a spear. And not only that, but they've done, I leave it to the Israelis, they've done research with like Bedouins who, you know, when you go out into the field, you have the number of stones in your sling that you have sheep in the meadow, because different days you have different numbers. So that's how all shepherds have slings and stones, and they spend their time practicing the slingshot. And they can attain tremendous accuracy and tremendous velocity. It's not a stretch to think that David was really good at this. So he comes to Goliath, and Goliath says to him, you're coming at me with sticks, which probably means that David was holding a staff, which was a feint, a decoy. David wasn't going to kill this guy with a staff. So from the very beginning, there is this sense of David being able to come up with solutions to problems that other people can't envision. And also, he takes good care of himself.
The fact that he's a shepherd.
Yes, is...
What does that say about who he is?
It says, according to the rabbis...
Is that a gentleness?
Well, Jacob was a shepherd, Moses was a shepherd. According to the rabbis, when God wants to pick a leader, he looks to see how they tend sheep. In other words, how are you with people who are powerless, whom you don't need? And that's a powerful thing. And certainly part of the loyalty that David attained over his life was because he did take care of people. But that image is transferred then to God, because as long as we're on it, I'm sure you have time for a very short sermon. When you go to a gravestone, you see sometimes in traditional graves these letters that stand for Tieh Nishmato Tzror B'Tzorah Chayim, which we usually translate as may his soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life. But a tzror in Hebrew, anyone know, is a pebble. And what you're really saying is that God should keep the stone of that soul like a shepherd with his sling. So it is an image of, of tending and goodness and caring for souls that can't care for themselves.
In a way, he's never that good again.
Yeah, in a way, he's never that good. That's David's golden moment.
In terms of women, you have a whole, there's a whole thread of...
So I didn't actually, until I really started to reread the story, I didn't know how soaked the story was in David's relationships with women in all sorts of ways. And I don't just mean sexually, although that's a big part of it, obviously, especially with Bathsheba, which I'm sure we'll get to. But David's unexpected quality. It won't surprise you if I say David was a great warrior, or David was a leader, or David founded Jerusalem. But David was an amazing listener. And over again, he listens to women in the story, and because of what they say, he changes his behavior, which is not something that you would associate either with a biblical hero, or with a king, or with a man, actually.
And before he starts having relationships, isn't it right after the Goliath moment that women are important, that there's some kind of cheering for him?
Yes. He starts off by being a rock star, basically. The women in the street say Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands, which is the beginning both of Saul's jealousy and probably of David's, I don't want to say it's the beginning of the inflation of his self-confidence, because he already killed Goliath, but it doesn't hurt.
So now he goes off after this triumph.
Yes.
And are we off to the races now? Is he...
Well, yes and no. He starts to be an intimate in Saul's house, and Saul already wants to get rid of him.
And is that patently clear that Saul has it out for him, or is there sort of also that father-son?
Well, no. Saul has a Saul has I don't know if ambiguous is the right word. Saul has an up and down relationship with David. That is, it's clear what it is at certain moments, but then it changes. I talk about, one of my favorite quotations is from Emerson, who said, "My moods don't believe one another." You know, when you're angry, you can't imagine what it's like to not be angry. And when you feel fine, you can't imagine why you were... Saul is that on steroids. That is, sometimes he wants to kill David, and then he's weeping and embracing David. He decides he's going to marry him to his daughter. He doesn't work out with the first daughter. I don't need to get into all that. But the second daughter, he marries him, and then he decides to kill him because he's going to use his daughter as a snare. And by the way, the bride price he asks, which you mentioned at the beginning, he says to David, "I need 100 Philistine foreskins so that you can marry my daughter." I didn't include, what's that?
Her name is?
Michal. I didn't include this in the book, although I thought about it. The line from Joseph Heller's God Knows, I included a different line. But Joseph Heller said it was at this moment that David realized that foreskins were more easily taken from dead Philistines. But he goes out and gets 200 foreskins and comes back as if to say to Saul, you know, you thought you were going to get me with this, and look. And now Saul turns from jealous to murderously paranoid of David because he sees. The thing is, what's interesting in a way about this is it's a little bit of an all about Eve moment in the sense that Saul sees that David has God's favor. It's clear, and there's nothing he can do about it. And everything he does to try to destroy David comes back on him in a bad way, but he can't help himself. He has to try to destroy him.
But David's sort of an easy brutality there. Is that something that, you know, in sort of the modern sensibility, I shouldn't be shocked by, that he goes and easily kills 200 people and obviously mutilates them? I mean, and we see it a lot. He seems to kill without hesitation. There doesn't seem to be any kind of moral hesitation.
Should I mention the most shocking thing that David does and then answer that question? And I don't make a big deal of this in the book, but the things that David does that we think of as terrible are actually not the worst thing. The worst thing that David does is later on, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's not. Later on, when David is running from Saul, and he has become an intimate of the Philistine king, and he wants to show his loyalty because he has nowhere else to go. If the Philistine king wants to kill him and Saul back in Israel wants to kill him, he's got nowhere to go. So he has to show the Philistine king that he's on board with him. So what he does is he tells the Philistine king, "I'm going to go raid villages in Judah, take the spoils, and bring them back to you." But he can't do that, of course, because if he does, he's killing his own people, and he's never going to be king of Judah if he spent his time killing them. So he goes to villages in Philistine territory that are non-Philistine, because remember, tribes of all different kinds lived in the same place. He goes to non-Philistine villages in Philistine territory, kills everyone, men, women, and children, so that nobody can go back and tell the Philistine king that David was really here killing and not in Judah, and takes their stuff and brings it back to his men and to the king. In other words, he wipes out villages to protect himself and to get booty. He doesn't make war on warriors, he wipes out villages. And you may find this somewhat disturbing. All I can say is that over the summer, I read 2 books. One is called War, What Is It Good For? By a guy named Ian Morris. And the other is Steven Pinker's book about the reduction of violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And both of them point out that we have an extraordinarily unrealistic view of how violent the world was 500 years ago, 700 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and that, in fact, even with the world wars, even with, Boko Haram and ISIS, even with all the depredations and terror of the modern world, that the curve of violence has headed steadily down. The graph is clear. There are almost no bumps. So that, for example, when you have a beheading in public, the whole world is scandalized, whereas if they had done that 500 years ago, everybody said, oh, beheading, and they would have brought their lunch, which people did to public hangings and executions, and they would have watched it, and it would have been a beheading. And the very outrage is an indication of how distant we are from that world. So I'm not saying this as a moral defense of David, but I'm saying that what you said is exactly right.
Routine.
Wiping out a village, that's what people did. That's what successful kings did to stay successful kings.
And just before we continue the story, in terms of the historical veracity of this, that's, I think, a lot of people's question. And you're now talking about the way things were.
Right.
So how much is this the way it happened?
71%. So
all go
I
home.
did, right, exactly. There are a couple different kinds of converging lines of evidence that you can find about the David story. One is other civilizations at the time. What were they doing? The second are archaeological remains, and I mentioned in there that 30 years ago, you could ask a serious question, did someone named David in ancient times ever live? Now that question has more or less been settled. In an inscription in particular that was found, 15, 20 years ago, that was from a couple hundred years after David, that was from a non-Israelite source that says Beit David, the house of David, on it, that refers to the king from Beit David. So there's almost no question that there was a David. Whether he was anything like the story depicts, you can't know.
Or that the conflicts happened.
Or that the conflicts happen, you can't know. They're very typical of the time. They're plausible. They have the feel of history. When you read the story of Abraham and then you read the story of David, they feel different. And also, in some ways, the most convincing part is a lot of the David story is he didn't do this. You might think he did this terrible thing, but he didn't. Every one of David's enemies somehow ends up dying, and it's never David's fault. Really, this happens like 5 times in the book. It's astonishing. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But you don't invent a hero and then invent apologies for things that people thought he did if he never existed. You just don't. He just didn't do such things. Why would you say, and by the way, David didn't like the fact that this enemy of his was killed, unless you're saying to a group of people who think that he did, this is a bad thing.
Let's go back to Saul. You made a joke about his mishigas, but it is,
yeah.
He's a mess of a person.
Saul is a mess, and someone should write the Saul book, which would be a great book to write, honestly, because in some ways Saul is the saddest character.
Describe a little bit of the...
So Saul is he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's a very tall man. And that's part of his distinction. There are 3, I mentioned about how tall men come to a bad end. One is David's oldest brother, Eliab, who doesn't get anointed. The other is Goliath, and the third is Saul. But Saul is a head taller than anyone else, which, makes a difference. And also, when Samuel anoints him, he's hiding from Samuel. Unlike David, who steps into the role with no hesitation. It's very Jewish to say, I really don't want, right? I don't want, pick someone else. When in fact, Isaiah says that, and Jeremiah says that. All the prophets are reluctant. Moses is the example of a prophet who tries, right? Says, pick anyone else you want, just not me. But David doesn't do that. There's no sign of David's reluctance when Samuel anoints him. He never says, don't anoint me, take one of my brothers, they're older, nothing. But Saul hides from being anointed, and then when he's anointed, he has some successes, but he never quite hit his stride. And people who are unsympathetic to Samuel, who's the priest that anointed him, say, in fact, that Samuel was in part responsible for that. I always think do you remember, some of you will, some of you won't, but do you remember when Ted Kennedy was defeated by Carter in the primaries, and he wouldn't endorse him at the convention. He sort of held his hand, but he wouldn't really hold his hand, and he let all of America know, yes, he's the nominee, but I'm not really happy about it. That's sort of how Samuel anointed Saul. It's yeah, I got to do this, But all of Israel, wink, wink, I just want you to know this isn't the best kind of king you could have. And in fact, in time, for a couple different reasons, Samuel, he drives Saul to the madness that was already there. So Saul has, Yehud Amichai has a beautiful poem about it, Saul's madness. But he has these dark moods. He goes in time to consult in the weirdest scene in all of the book of Samuel. He goes to consult a witch after he's forbidden other people to consult a witch. Even she takes pity on him because he's clearly so depressed, and he's a melancholy character. Yeah.
And now let's get to Jonathan, his son.
Okay.
Because I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of this.
So, yes.
Is the David-Jonathan sexual tension. Or
the thing, or relationship,
whatever
it is.
Whatever.
Kingships are hereditary. You know that, right? It's supposed to be the kid that becomes king. That means that when Saul dies, Jonathan is going to be king. And the only way that Jonathan will not be king is if he A, dies, or B, abdicates to David. And remarkably enough, both of those things happen. That is, first, David comes into Saul's house, and all of a sudden, not only does Saul love him, he marries Saul's daughter and becomes best friends with Saul's son. And now, as I said, with David, it's always a gestalt. You can see that one of two ways. Either, what a great guy, what a charismatic, wonderful guy. He walks into a household and everyone loves him. Or, what a Machiavellian schemer that he walks into this household and gets his daughter to fall in love and his son to be his best friend, at least. We'll talk about that in a second.
Which do you think it is?
I think it's both. I don't think people are that simple. I think it's an extraordinarily rare person who's so coldly psychopathic that they could walk into a house and say, I'm going to make all these people love me so that I can be king, and calculates it. Most people need human warmth. I think that he probably both thought that, if you say, for example, so let's say a very rich, powerful man comes into this room right now. You're going to be nice to him. Now, are you going to be nice to him out of calculation or out of genuineness or a combination of both? It's a combination of both. There's something about going into the house of the king. You want to be nice to the king. He's the king. And even if you know you're never going to get anything out of it, people are, it's like, you walk into the Oval Office, it's a lot easier to say negative things outside the office than it is. Ehrlichman actually told that story. I'm going far afield, sorry.
Okay.
But Ehrlichman tells this story about Nixon, that there were protesters outside the White House, and he said to Nixon, you should really meet with them. And Nixon, being personally not an easy, comfortable kind of guy, said, I don't want to do that. And Ehrlichman pushed him, and finally he brought these protesters who were screaming about the Vietnam War into the Oval Office, and they couldn't say a word. Because it's very different. So David is still a kid when he comes to the king. So he probably had real feelings, but was it also a calculation? I don't doubt it. The thing about Jonathan is, it never says whether David's relationship with Jonathan is sexual. What David says in that famous eulogy is, your love to me was as dear as the love of women. Now, in florid masculine friendship verses, which you can find all through history, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were sexually involved. You can find equally sexual things in letters between men in the 18th century or in Shakespeare, but I don't think it's a far stretch to believe that they were. So you could go either way. Jonathan clearly loved David. Whether David loved Jonathan back, again, David never says my love was equal to the love of women. He says yours was. So in both things, I think it depends what you bring to it. They could have been involved romantically, they could have been involved sexually, they could have been involved on a friendship level, and any way you slice it, David came out a winner.
And in terms of when Jonathan dies,
Yes.
is that a true mourning of him? Do you think that he cares honestly at that point?
I think that we see David when he's devastated in mourning. And this doesn't seem quite the same, but there is this beautifully crafted eulogy, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of poetry in the Bible or even outside of the Bible. So if in fact you believe that artistry has something to do with intensity of emotion, then yeah.
So for all of David's easy brutality, he spares Saul many
Yes.
times. Can you talk about why you think that is?
Yeah, he has on two separate occasions at least, he could easily have killed Saul and doesn't, or restrains his men from killing Saul.
Can you tell the one, the cave?
Well, so Saul is either urinating or defecating in a cave, depending on how you read the verse. And David comes up behind him and cuts off part of his cloak without his feeling it. At least so it says. And then he runs away and he holds up the cloak and he says, "Look, I could have killed you." And Saul, as happens sometimes, dissolves into tears and regret. And there's another time when David's men want to kill him. And the point is, first of all, that David, I think, feels a certain fear about killing God's anointed, because this is still God's anointed. He probably knows he's going to be king. I mean, Saul's days are numbered. And also, I think it's probably true that it's bad to set that precedent. You don't want to be the incoming king who kills the previous king. First of all, it gives people ideas, right? It's not a good thing to be, well, look, he killed his predecessor, so... and second, it also creates much more opposition. You have to think past the day of anointing if you're a smart king. So it creates much more opposition. Saul's house already for 2 years, which people don't realize, if you ask them who were the kings of Israel, most people will say, I don't know. But the people who know will say Saul and then David. But actually, after Saul died, his son Ishbosheth is king up in the north for 2 years, while David is king in the south. So there already is opposition to David. By the way, in case you're wondering, yes, Ishbosheth is killed in his bed, and yes, David wasn't there, and yes, when they come and tell David they did it, he gets very upset and has the assassins put to death, because how could they raise their hand against Ishbosheth? And this is a pattern that recurs with alarming frequency in David's life.
We'll talk about when he hears the news of Saul's death.
This is the exact same thing. We know, in fact, that Saul kills himself. He asks his sword bearer to kill him, but the sword bearer doesn't want to do it. He's already been injured, and he doesn't want the Philistines to desecrate his body. And he doesn't want them to torture him. So he commits suicide. And there is, by the way, there are 2 suicides in the book of Samuel, and no hint of disapproval in the Bible itself, which is an interesting thing. But leave that aside for a moment. So an Amalekite comes to David, carrying Saul's crown and his band, in other words, all the accoutrements of kingship, which, by the way, very conveniently explains how David got them without taking them from Saul, but I'll just put that aside for a moment, and says, I killed Saul. And David says, how dare you raise your hand against the Lord's anointed? And then he points to his boys who are there and says, kill him, and they do. Which again means not only does David have his enemy killed, but he also kills the only people who could possibly ever say, but David asked us to do this. So if you want to make the case against David, and there are books that do, it's there for you. But on the other hand, let's be uncynical for a moment and think, is it possible that David really was upset that they had killed Saul or Ishbosheth? I mean, it may be hard for us to believe, but it's not impossible to think that it could have happened. And he was what, the story is that when Napoleon had to appoint a new general, he would only ask one question about him. Is he lucky? And I think it is true that the most successful people in history have been usually extraordinarily lucky. Napoleon among them, actually, until Wellington. But he was extraordinarily lucky. And there are times when you just look at David's story and you don't know how much he made his own luck, but he was at times very lucky.
Well, let's talk about that luck, because you do talk about, you say over and over again that he was God's chosen one.
Yes.
That God was with him.
Yes.
And it's not quite clear. God's not really in this story very much.
No, not the way he is in the Torah. And when I say lucky, that is theologically, I suppose, a euphemism for God's favor. That's certainly how the rabbis read it.
So what does that mean? I mean, how does
That means that, first of all, God makes the most comprehensive promise to David of any character in the Torah. He says to him, your throne will be everlasting. That's why David is the precursor to the Messiah, which is David's greatest role in Jewish history. When you sing David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, that means David, King of Israel, alive and forever. And the reason we sing that is not because David is alive, but because David's house is supposed to be alive forever.
Do you want to sing that now?
Can I dance? No, I actually can't. So the favor of God is that in the book, with the exception of calling up Samuel from the dead, which is a kind of murky incident that may or may not be literal, there are no miracles. It's not like God says, I'm going to win this war for you and wipes people out. He will tell David, you'll win, but there are no miracles. So God's favor is exercised through the agency of human coincidence and human luck and David's skill and the people with whom he surrounds himself.
But we've got to get to Bathsheba. Bathsheba, what do we
Right.
say? What's the Jewy way?
Well, English is Bathsheba and
Okay.
Hebrew is Bathsheba.
Okay. This seems to be a pretty central and pivotal moment, not just the passion that they had, but the crime that results.
It's his most, it's his worst moment, and I suppose if you want to, it could be his best moment too. But just to give a quick précis of what happens, it's not just that David sees this woman on the roof bathing and goes and sleeps with her and commits adultery. And by the way, again, Bathsheba is a Rorschach test. Was she trying to get David's attention? Was she seducing the king, or was the king forcing her by virtue of his power and position? And this is obviously, you can read it either way, but it's interesting to contemplate the question. So he sends for her, he sleeps with her, and then she tells him she's pregnant. And the reason that it's mentioned that she was bathing is that means that she wasn't pregnant before that. She was just overcoming her period. He's the first person to sleep with her. Her husband, who, by the way, is a Hittite, he's Uriah the Hittite. He's not even an Israelite. He's, again, one of the tribes that lives in the territory of Judah that is fighting for David, okay? It's a non-Jew fighting for the Jewish king whose wife he sleeps with, and then gets her pregnant and says, bring Uriah home, because he's got to get Uriah now to sleep with his wife. Because if Bathsheba shows up pregnant, they're going to know it wasn't her husband. Brings Uriah home, and Uriah the Hittite says, how can I sleep with my wife when all of Israel is fighting for your, I can't go sleep with her. So David, in increasingly ratcheted up cynicism, we haven't gotten to the peak yet, he gets him drunk. And he figures now he's going to go home and sleep with his wife. Because remember, if David saw Bathsheba from the roof, the house can't be that far away, right? And still Uriah won't. He sleeps on the porch of the palace because he won't go home and sleep with his wife. If David had a palace or whatever kind of building he had.
Because he's so loyal.
He's so loyal to, and here's where, I don't know if you want how the rabbis try to get David out of this sin. I'll come back to that if you're interested. But David finally realizes that there's no way to get Uriah to sleep with his wife. So in the zenith of his cynicism, in the peak of his evil machinations, he writes a letter to Joab, who is his chief of staff, basically. And again, a fascinating figure, but we don't have time for everything. That's why even with all this, you still need to read the book, or just to buy it. And write an Amazon review. That's really all I ask. I don't care. You don't have to. But in the zenith of his cynicism, he writes a note to Joab that says, put this guy in the front of the fighting and make sure he gets killed. And gives it to Uriah and says, here, take this to Joab. Which he does, and he does. And he dies. And you think about this, and this is David. This is the king of Israel. This is the person who's supposed to be, the precursor of the Messiah. So the one scintilla of redemption that exists in this story is that the prophet Nathan comes to him and tells this parable about how a rich man had many sheep and a poor man had one little lamb, and the rich man had guests, and so he took the one little lamb of the poor man and slaughtered it. And David says, such a person deserves to die. And it's brilliant of Nathan to do it that way, because what he does is, first of all, he has David proclaim sentence on himself, and he also gives him a chance to be noble before he accuses him, which is an important thing. So he puts David in the place of, I am a good person, before he shows him how he wasn't, as opposed to just coming in and saying, you rotten, SOB, which is not biblical language anyway. So, scion of Bible is what that means. So then he says to him, after David says such a man deserves to die, he goes, you're the man.
Who says that?
Nathan. And the way that I put it in the book is, what's the best thing about David is what he doesn't do at that moment. What he doesn't do is say, off with this prophet's head. Because he could. He's king. Saul kills all these priests. You can do, as an ancient king, you can do whatever you want. But David doesn't, because the one thing that is remarkably steady is David's recognition of God's sovereignty. That is, he'll violate God's law, but he'll never. My brother, who's a sociologist, told me many years ago that in sociology there's a distinction between a revolutionary and a criminal. A criminal says, yeah, the law is the law and I'm breaking it. A revolutionary doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the law. I'm not breaking it because the law is not legitimate. David acts as a criminal, but never as a revolutionary. He never becomes an idolater. He never denies God. He never doesn't feel like he's accountable to God. And that's, I think, his redemption.
But when Nathan says that or teaches him that lesson, is there also a moment of recognition of, my God, look who I am? I'm a monster?
Not a monster. He's a sinner. I don't think he thought of himself as a monster. And he, in fact, not only does he not think of himself as a monster, but, the child from that union of David and Bathsheba dies. And the way that it happens is, for 7 days, while the child is born, before it dies, David fasts and prays, and then when it dies, he stands up. And when his servants say to him, what's with that? He says, well, look, while it was alive, I thought maybe God would take pity and let the child live. But now I know, and he says in this beautiful line, he says, now I will go to him, but he will never come back to me. So, the thing is, every time you think you've got David pinned down, that you discover that there's a person there, and it's not so easy. So,
to tie this into the story you just told, this child dies. It's his first child,
yes.
Right? And that's, however much he recovers, it's a very big loss,
yes.
Right? And it's a big punishment.
Yes.
And you say that the rabbi, it's Nathan, predicts that he's going to be kind of hit 4 different ways. He's going to be punished 4 different ways,
yes.
And that represents the loss of his 4 children in the future.
Right. Well, Nathan, Rashi uses that interpretation to talk about all the children that he will lose, and the prominent among them is Absalom, and that's how Absalom becomes a rebel against his father. Is again a slightly long story that involves, as you said at the very beginning, a rape. Absalom's half-brother Amnon rapes his full sister Tamar, to make a somewhat long story short. And Absalom, in revenge, kills Amnon.
All of those are David's children.
All those are David's children.
So one of his sons rapes his daughter.
Rapes his daughter, and then another son kills the son that raped him.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
And then he runs away.
And the son runs away. They are eventually reconciled again through the agency of a woman who comes to David and talks about how her son is estranged, and David says, you should bring him back, or I'll bring him back, and then in the end, he brings back Absalom, and Absalom starts a rebellion against him that almost succeeds. It doesn't by the slimmest of stratagems, which, as I mentioned in there, is actually a stratagem that was studied, and it has a paper in the CIA archives that was recently declassified. You can read about David's stratagem and what it means for modern spyware and spycraft. And in the end, he says to his troops, I'll just tell the very end of the story. He says to his troops, go out basically and crush the rebellion, but don't hurt my son Absalom. Now, it's very hard to do that. And Yoav, whom I mentioned before, who's David's chief of staff and lead military officer, there's no way he's going to let Absalom live, right? After he rebels against David and all the troops and so on and so forth. So Absalom, who is clearly vain and, again, very good looking, which is always a warning in the Bible, he gets hung by his hair in the tree. He's suspended between the ground and the heavens, very symbolic. And Yoav and his henchmen kill Absalom. So David discovers that Absalom has been killed and goes into unparalleled mourning, like nothing else. Faulkner's book, Absalom, Absalom, that's a reinterpretation of the Absalom story. David says Absalom's name over and over again. He can't eat. Everybody sees that the king is devastated. And part of it you have to feel is David sees the consequences of his own actions with his family and with his children. Anyway, Yoav, though, the military man, comes to David and says, cut this out. Don't you realize that you're mourning for the person who would kill you and insulting all the people who saved you? And your troops aren't going to be your troops much longer if they see that they put their lives on the line for you, and all you have to say is, oh, the poor guy who was trying to kill me, I'm so upset for him. So you feel like the bracing voice of military reality, and finally David snaps out of it and thanks his troops and goes back to being king. And then in the end has to anoint Solomon, who is Bathsheba's second child.
This is a question from someone, and a good one. David is also known as a poet. We haven't gotten to his poetry.
We haven't even talked about his poetry.
We don't have all night.
Yeah.
At what point in his life did he write the Psalms that are attributed to him?
I am tempted to say at no point in his life did he write the Psalms that are attributed to him, because some of them first of all, it's not even clear that they're attributed to him, strangely enough. Mizmor li David could mean many things. It could mean a psalm about David, a psalm to David. It doesn't have to mean a psalm by David. Some of them are clearly not written by David, even though they say Mizmor li David, because they refer to events that happened after David died. Some of them refer to events in David's life, but you have to do a little bit of crafting to make them fit. So most likely David had a reputation as a musician or a poet. He certainly has some poetry in the book of Samuel that he may in fact have written, and some of the Psalms may be to his hand, but it's impossible to say who wrote them or when. One psalm says a psalm when he fled from Absalom. Did he write that as he fled from Absalom? You can't say he certainly didn't, but it's hard to prove that he did.
Which is your favorite? Do you have one?
My favorite psalm? My favorite psalm is Psalm 139, but not for... But I'd have to talk a lot about it to say I also love Psalm 51 and the first psalm, and of course, who doesn't love Psalm 23? I mean, the truth is, yes, okay, it's overdone, but it's overdone because the Lord is my shepherd is a beautiful psalm. It's beautiful in King James Version, it's beautiful in Hebrew, it's an extraordinary piece of poetry.
But let's end with a quote from Shimon Peres, whom you quote, who said, "Not everything King David did on land or on roofs appears to me to be Judaism." He did not prefer him to be a role model.
No.
He preferred Moses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, Moses had his moments too. There was a lot of death in the desert, and a lot of fighting, and a lot of killing of Israelites, which we like to forget sometimes. But here's what I would say. You can have a role model whose conduct you don't always emulate. And by that I mean, do you want someone who acts like David? In some ways, obviously not, and yet there would be no one to think about that had there not been a David. In other words, David was the indispensable person for his time. Had he been a more admirable figure according to our terms, Israel wouldn't have survived, and there wouldn't have been a David, and there wouldn't have been a kingdom. So you have to make a choice in what way you're judging the past by the canons of the present. Having said that, there are things about David that are enormously admirable, and I'll just close with this. Here was a man who, as far as we know his story, succeeded in being almost everything that a human being of that time could be. In building family, in being a father, being a husband, being a child, being a king, being a warrior, being a poet, being a disciple of a king, having relations with prophets and priests, being an exemplar from the time he was young to people who cheered him, fending off multiple rebellions, not just one, and also doing something that is extraordinarily unusual. Louis XIV said, "May I be killed by my enemies and not by my children," because a lot of kings were dispatched, a lot of kings died, very few kings got to die in their beds, and usually they were killed by their own kids who wanted to be king. David dies as an old man in his bed, and as he dies, he instructs his son on how to be king. That's an extraordinary achievement in the ancient world, and not very often repeated. And I like to think of David's death this way. I talk about this drash in the book, but it's very beautiful what the rabbis notice. In the first chapter of the book of Kings, it says, Melech David Zaken Baba Yamim. King David was old, advanced in years. Okay? Listen to that sentence carefully. King David was old, advanced in years. One chapter later, it says, Vayikrevu Yemei David Lamut. David was dying. What's the difference? When he's old, he's called King David. But when he's dying, he's David. And that idea that when you confront your death, you confront it not as a king, not as a role, but just as who you are, as David, I think, ought to enable us to try to look at him that way. That is, he was put in a position where if you weren't ruthless, you wouldn't survive. But you didn't have to be a poet and an inspirational figure and a creator of an empire and someone who gives a legacy to thousands of years. That was the part of David that made him special. There were a lot of ruthless people around, but very few of them, if any, were David. And I think that's one of the reasons why he remains not just a remarkable figure, but a lastingly relevant one. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV on JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.